familiar with the show, but it's been a 4-month activation around Miami-Dade County, and we are so honored to have David Brooks as a participant and an artist that's kind of presents definitely one of my favorite works in the show. And we are honored to have David, and yeah, thank you so much for coming. We've had a number of artist talks, and this is the last one. So thank you.
We're really excited about this one too, because David speaks so well, as you guys will learn shortly. Quick shout out, thanks to the Knight Foundation for making the Commuter Biennial possible, as well as the state of Florida and Miami-Dade County. And we'll talk a little bit more about the biennial at the end, so save up your questions for when we start doing some Q&A. But if you haven't seen the sculpture yet, it's in the Blue Lagoon lake next to the 836, and you'll be able to drive past it and see it for a little while. So if you haven't seen it yet, I hope you'll get a chance to drive by, whether you're going to the airport or stuck in traffic. It's a fun interaction. We'll leave the rest to David, so thank you guys for coming.
I would like to introduce you. So
yeah, sure.
Artist living in Brooklyn, New York. He has exhibited at Sculpture Storm King Art Center, MoMA PS1, Bluebell Family Collection, to name a few. And he's the recent recipient of the Rome Prize. So congratulations, he'll be leaving us soon for Rome. And we're very honored to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm in pain a little bit today. I was skateboarding last night and took a lot of spills, and so I hope that doesn't affect my speech capabilities. But, all right, so since we're such a nice, intimate group, and I don't bite, so feel free to just ask questions as we go along, because rather than too formal of a situation, okay? So, and thank you, Laura and Courtney, for having us, and thanks, Nina, for letting us be here. So for those of you a few of you have heard me talk before, so you're gonna have a few repeat things. Make sure and laugh at the jokes at the same time, no less. So a lot of my work is looking at relationships to the natural world, and specifically, often I try and find relationships between our built environment and the natural world, or for in the very least, the moment or the place where they have a confrontation, and the irrationalities that are all in that moment of confrontation, because we are living in a very unprecedented time, geologically, evolutionarily speaking, and it's interesting. It's not that it's just sad, it's also interesting and complex. And so the complexities of it really do mirror the kind of irrationalities that are embedded in our own culture, which are interesting. They're also, and I'm an optimist in the end. I'm actually quite an optimist. And so, but I'm starting at quite a young age, coming from Brazil, Indiana. You all know Brazil, Indiana? But I was very much like come in, welcome. I think there's some chairs in the back there. We just started, so don't be shy. So I grew up around cornfields, and that was pretty much it. And so I had become really fascinated with all this information I had learned about, of course, through things like National Geographic and other things about these far-off exotic lands and things, and about what this thing called nature was, because I couldn't see it around me necessarily, because I was surrounded by a monoculture of cornfields. And so I really, from a very young age, wanted to really be out in the field seeing these things and trying to understand it, not just through statistics and data and information, but actually going out and seeing it and experiencing it. So the tactility of these things and being, it's a little, can we get it brighter, you think? We'll go with it. Everybody see it okay? Kind of? How are we doing? Should I move it a little forward? Okay. So that's an image there with, tell me when, how's that?
That's better.
Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh yeah, that is a lot better. Okay, good. So that's me back in 1997 in the southern Venezuelan Amazonas region. That's Juan Rosaleon Valadez, for all of you that might know him. Obviously a lot thinner back then, I was. Obviously much more handsome today. So that was, we didn't really know what the heck we were doing. I'm gonna try and raise that, there we go. I just knew that I wanted to go and see this place that I'd heard a lot about. And so we were there and we worked with ornithologists who were doing bird tagging. Again, this is 1997, working with some herpetologists. That's people that work with amphibians and reptiles. But I really just wanted to see this place called the Amazon, because in my mind it of course was this great exotic place of escape in the Western imagination. And so there is that cliche of it, but it also is a place of great organic abyss of biodiversity. It really does test the limits of our own knowledge and capabilities of what science can do. It also is a place of modern day slavery and exploitation. It really is a place of great fragility, and it is a place of great robustness, and it is one of the great kind of fuel tanks of the global economy, with resources that are extracted out of South America and sent around the planet. So it's a very important place for me to kind of go and see. And in a way, like a lot of landscapes or conflicted sites, it's a place that really does embrace all of those things at one time. That's a golden-headed manakin there in Guyana on the border of Brazil, working with some ornithologists, herpetologists. This is back in 1997, where this German young herpetologist would grab anything in the jungle at night. And so I'm sure he's no longer alive. This is one of the oldest geologic forms on Earth, Cerro Duida, at the confluence of the Rio Orinoco. But it wasn't until 2005, jumping forward, when I met this guy, Nathan Lujan, where kind of what it was about this field science and evolution, where things begin to kind of come closer into focus for me. So he studies these critters here, which are called Loricariidae, armored catfish. And the reason this specific family of organisms is really important is because they do test the levels of our knowledge base and how we build our knowledge base, meaning that the amount of diversity of the family of Loricariidae, the more they are studied, the more that level of diversity goes up. In other words, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. And so that's a really fascinating thing for me to kind of see. This is also in the Loricariidae family. This is a fish that's evolved to look like a piece of wood. And in the same family of fish is this fish, which has evolved to be able to eat wood. And so it's a very diverse family of organisms. And I'm showing you all of this because you can kind of see how we try and study this stuff. We're trying to create a story around it. It's also embedded in deep time, where here this is showing a plate tectonic shift, where in the Miocene, 11 million years ago, there was a plate tectonic shift where the Amazon for a short amount of time became a saltwater sea, and it was inundated by the ocean, and then it shifted back again and became a freshwater drainage. What happened in that period of time is that things readapted and evolved. And so you can very specifically mirror that geologic timeline with the evolutionary timeline. And with doing that, you get a clear roadmap as to how evolution itself works, which is kind of like witnessing God themselves, you know. So the Miocene epoch showing the saltwater sea. What we do, though, is go out and do this field work. So we go out into these areas that have not been surveyed, and we do surveys both of fish, mostly of fish, but also of birds and reptiles. And we do a lot of processing of the specimens, which includes also taking tissue samples for DNA sequencing. We also here are making lunch. We also are shaving and make sure we're well groomed and always looking our best. This is the first fish I was able to actually name. This is a fish new to science. And there's a teacher I had in undergrad who was from New Orleans, and she was very like family. She passed away 3 years ago. And she helped actually fund a number of these expeditions we've been doing since 2005. And she's through the McElhenney Tabasco family, actually. So her name was Urzi Schwartz, and so we had to, of course, Latinize the name. So this is Ancestris E. Schwartzi. And since then, there's been 5 more species named after her, and eventually there'll be an entire genus, meaning there will be an entire branch of the knowledge base that we have that will represent this one human being's kind of intervention into it and support of it. So a lot of this scientific work is culture. It's a cultural network, or in a cultural, what I like to use the word imbroglio, where there's many different things that all intertwine at one moment that you can't necessarily pull them apart and see them individually. And that also goes with what field work is itself. I mean, it's very much, it's an interesting situation because you're thrown out into the middle of these remote areas with a bunch of scientists, and then like there's like the token artist tagging along, and of course you can imagine the jokes that go into like what kind of artwork I'm going to make out of this expedition. Am I going to have people that are naked doing performances playing cellos? Am I going to, like, you know, so there's a lot of that goes on. There's also a lot of slaughter in a way. I mean, in order to study and protect these organisms, these beings, these living, breathing beings, you actually have to process them. You have to collect them. They become part of a database and a collection within a museum to where they can be referenced over time and be verified that they are their own individual specimen, their own individual species, I mean. And so it's a strange situation because it's hard, for me, it's hard to stomach all of that psychologically, but I also understand it, and then in the dangers that these environments face. It's a really important part of the process of protecting it. So this photography in the field here, that's the smallest bird on planet Earth. Slugging through the Everglades, Brian Booth, who's in the crowd here, and some other friends, we've done a lot of trekking through the Everglades area. And I think what's important here with these kind of images is that when we're looking at this thing called nature, what for me it's like looking at living, breathing beings that are sharing the planet with us, not just some kind of preconceived idea of what nature is. And so that's why for me it's so important to kind of be out in there, kind of being with them. And sometimes it's really just about showing our love for them, our affection in a way, if you will. And sometimes it really goes deep and it can kind of keep on going. And so really that could also be seen as just the whole point of that. I'm going to show a couple past projects that kind of illustrate this idea of what I think of as an imbroglio, this idea of contradictory elements that actually create the world we live in, and they cannot be unentwined. And but as well, I'm focusing on a few projects that really look at urban space and maybe even infrastructure in a way. So Desert Rooftops was a project that was commissioned by the Art Production Fund to be exhibited in Times Square a few years back. And I know the South Florida landscape better than any other landscape because I've just spent so much time down here. So I don't really like to speak about Brazil, Indiana, where I come from, because I don't really know much about it beyond it being a monoculture of corn. And so on being an aspiring skateboarder, when I was 16 years old, I ran as quick as I could out of that place. So, but I've been coming to South Florida since I was 13 years old regularly, and I've lived down here at different times throughout my life. And so I consider it really a home away from home. What's fascinating about South Florida is you have a 6 million year evolutionary fact of the Everglades. So it took about 6 million years after the sea levels dropped and we had variations and stabilization of climate for what the Everglades is to form into not a balance, because nothing's ever in this notion of what we'd call a balance, but into a kind of cohabitation with each other, into the formation we understand to be the Everglades today. And then if we look through that, on the right-hand side here, we have what's called the urban development boundary line, which a lot of you may know about the urban development boundary line that borders all along between the Everglades and the built environment here. What's always fascinated me with South Florida is a place that I may go away for 6 months and come back 6 or 9 months later, and entire landscapes that I've known are gone and just razed and either filled with fill or already houses booming on it, or complete with a hospital and gas station already. So it's a speed and a scale that is startling, and you can watch it in real time unfold. And so the project that for Times Square is I wanted to kind of combine these different worlds. We had Times Square being really what could be understood as a great memorial or monument to global consumerism, coupled with a landscape that is being consumed, and use these kind of two variations of them to generate this idea of what's called desertification. So desertification is as old as civilization is old. In fact, Jared Diamond, in his book, I forget the name of the book at the moment, Why Civilizations Collapse, but his theory around the Mayan tradition and civilization was that they actually desertified their landscape, not too different from what we're doing right now, which is you're over-cultivating a landscape until it becomes arid and inhospitable to growth. So you can take that notion of inhospitality to other organisms into this notion of kind of a monoculture of a landscape itself in our built environment. So the idea is here is that between industrial agriculture and our own ideas of the desert and the built environment, we can begin to see how patterns arise and make a kind of similar formation between them formally. In Times Square then, what was this area called the last lot, where there's a plot of land that had a kind of canyon of skyscrapers around it, and it wasn't abutted up next to another building. And so that was a piece of land that was originally an old hotel that was then raised. It was supposed to become a skyscraper, and then the recession hit, and the company went bankrupt. So it laid empty for many years. So we were contacted, or Art Production Fund was contacted to kind of generate some kind of interest of public art in the Times Square area. And this was really literally the only piece of existing land that was not built on in that whole entire area of Times Square, which is a perfect place to build suburban rooftops. So we then proceeded to build this formation of rooftops. In my mind, they were very much like sand dune formations. In fact, they were built to New York City building code because when we showed the Department of Buildings the plans for it, they said, looks like a building. Okay, it has to be built like this and this and this. Where's your foundation? You need such and such scale of structural materials, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, no, it's a sculpture. It's only going to be up for 3 months. It doesn't matter. It looks like a building. Must be a building. So we actually had to build the entire thing to New York City building code. And I'll explain what we did with that aspect of the process in a minute here. As well, in New York City, it's interesting how labor works because some properties in New York City are grandfathered in as union lots and some are not. And sometimes the way properties have been mixed-matched over the years or over the century, part of a lot may be grandfathered in as union and part of it not. And so at one point we had one of those inflatable rats. Have you all seen that? When developers don't use union workers and then the unions show up and inflate a 20-foot high rat, which is called Scab. Or Scabby is the name of the rat. So we had one, so we showed up at 7 a.m. on the first day and they had a rat there by 10 a.m. And so I was like, what's going on? Like, we're not developers, I'm an artist. And they showed us the plans, I'm like, well, I didn't know, we were told this was not union lot. I mean, it's just a bunch of artists here all working. So by 1 p.m. after lunch, we had a whole entire union crew there who were actual union trained roofers. Kind of worked out great and perfect because they really did the perfect kind of level of shoddiness that is typical in suburban rooftop construction. If I were to go through and adhere every single shingle myself, it would be way too nice because artists get finicky and it's a little bit off, so you have to square it off and like make the nail nice and neat, make all the nails line up nice and neat, make sure all the tape is removed, laid nice, you know. So they went through and they're like done with the whole rooftop by the time they leave that one single day. So there's a shoddiness to it that actually is very, which was very real. It was very authentic in a way. So here, this view, you can see we're almost done constructing. And then here, this is a completed view. The light bouncing off all the skyscrapers around it kind of changed the lighting throughout the project as the day went on. And there was, all the sightlines were really quite different and really thought of as a landscape. This right here was very specifically modeled after my grandmother's backyard area where her garage comes next to her house. So I was pulling from familiar notions of architecture that just make it that familiar, give it a familiarity. So here you can kind of get that undulating sand dune sensibility. So the whole thing was composed very unconventionally using diagrams of how sand dunes themselves are formed, but it was built extremely conventionally and to New York City building code. Around it then I had these interpretive signs, which you would have, of course, at a national park to kind of tell you what you're looking at. So you come up to the sign, and there's this big, beautiful sand dune landscape, a description of hot spots of desertification around the world, how a sand dune is formed, a little about industrial agriculture, and what the definition of desertification is, but no mention of rooftops. And so it was really left up to the viewers to reconcile that difference between what they're looking at and what the interpretation is telling them. I think that it was usually typically people that were under the age of 14 that had no problem making that reconciling moment of interpreting the sign with what they're looking at. It was usually people that were over the age of 35 or 40 that had the hardest time bringing those interpretations together. One of my this piece, because it was public, a very prominent piece in the public sphere in New York, got a lot of press of course, a lot of criticism. Even Fox News spun a whole controversy around it, like trying to say that this is not art. And, and they're in the building right behind where it says Jersey Boys. That building right behind them is the Fox building. And so they were constantly out there every day for weeks. And then they finally brought me into the studio for their version of Good Morning America. And they're like, okay, well, folks, we know that this has been a controversial project. And I'm thinking, I was in the green room watching them say, like, you spun the controversy. Nobody else cared if this is art or not. It's like, well, people just can't believe this is being called art. So we brought the artist here today to the studio, and we're going to ask him some questions. And so I come out and we're asking questions, like, well, what do you think? I mean, how do people even know this is art? There's no frame around it. I mean, how do they know? And and so it's like, well, I think that's a really productive place for an artwork in the public realm to sit. And first of all, that's a 140-year-old conversation. That's not my job. And in fact, if somebody unknowingly experiences this work of art and they're not really preparing themselves in a kind of predetermined way in which they might approach a work of art, then how more productive and fruitful for them to kind of have this moment of like, wait, that's art? And then they kind of reconcile it for themselves. They have an interpretive moment, and it's on the scale of their own built environment. And and then they're like, oh, I think you're really onto something there, David. like, not sure about that, but okay. So this piece also, so it was in a lot of press, but my favorite press that it got was on all the skateboarder blogs. And so, because I'm an old skateboarder, you know, got the bruises and things to show. But, and so they were talking like, oh, this David Brooks guy, I Googled him, and apparently he writes for the New York Times. And but he must have been a skateboarder or something, because man, me and Seth broke in last night over the fence, and we got a couple runs in, but the cops showed up. And so anyway, so skaters were apparently like jumping the fence at night and like doing some drop-ins on it and stuff. So that was just like really like one of the most wonderful moments of my art career, in that where all my worlds united in a way. And then a big snowstorm came through, and it really began to blanket it and create this other sense of a landscape that's really talking about another landscape that's not even within this city landscape. So since it was built in New York City Building Code, and since Sotheby's was paying for it, we built it in order to be able to come back apart. And which costs, so architecture like this is typically what I would refer to as disposable architecture. It's never really meant to come back apart. It just kind of falls apart and gets thrown away and then replaced or something. So we had to build this though to come back apart, because then all the materials, all the wood was then given to Habitat for Humanity, where they then became real rooftops. And so that aspect of like the life around work is also very important to a lot of projects I do. The installation of it in Times Square that looks like rooftops is just one moment of the life and full life cycle of all of this material and the people involved and the notions around it. And so that life around the work is really important to me. We did, though, extract a few little sections of it in an homage to one of my favorite artists, Gordon Matta Clark, some of you may know, and where we just going into a building, just extracted a whole section, which then became their own kind of artifacts that were suspended and became an exhibition at the Tang Museum, almost like specimens themselves, extracted out of this environment.
Where's the Tang Museum?
It's in Saratoga Springs, New York.
Skidmore College, right?
Skidmore College, exactly. Back to our Lower Caride friends. So the fish. So there's in Art Basel, not Art Basel Miami, but Art Basel, Basel, Switzerland. There's a thing called statements. Art Basel Miami, they don't do a statement sector, they do something else sector, like a focus positions maybe, I'm forgetting. So statements in Basel is that they give 10 solo shows to either emerging or mid-career artists, and you're supposed to like make a statement. Often people just do a basic show, not really making a statement. But some artists really make a statement. And so I wanted to, of course, make a statement. And so our friends here that you saw before, our Lower Caride that have evolved to look like wood or be able to eat wood, it's a known thing amongst these scientists to study them. And a lot of these scientists who do study them are interested not necessarily in fish, but in evolution. And it's a known thing that a lot of these fish that are studied that are unknown to science exist in private collections throughout people's homes. So there is a whole industry that's been ongoing since the 60s and 70s where fish are harvested out of these rivers in the Amazon basin, and then they are exported to primarily Germany was one of the biggest leaders in that market, as well as Japan, and then also Switzerland behind them. In the United States as well now is, of course, too, but really predominantly in Germany, Switzerland, and Japan. So next to people's sofas or flanking the dinner table or whatever would be fish unknown to science, sitting there living, breathing, living with you. That's interesting in a couple different perspectives. So I want to kind of take that notion, looking at where the range of these fish are, which interestingly enough, the exportation paths to get them out of South America mirrors the drug trade. But this is, this is what's called a cladogram listing all of the known species within this family of fish. And you can see it's quite a lot, right? And so now if you're welcome to start reading that top line for me, you'll see now just by the sheer scale of it, this is a list of all of the known unknowns, meaning these are all species that are that circulate in the high-end aquarium trade on a global level, but that are unstudied by science. They lack a species name. They only have an L number for Loocaridae, but they also have then a description. So it'll say like L23 yellow-spotted Xingu River. And that's all we know about it, but it's, they're not part of the knowledge base, the taxonomic system. So I want to take this moment to cross the flows of the consumerism of Art Basel, which is arguably a place where there's more money exchange for contemporary subjectivity than any other place on earth, and cross the flows of that commodification of subjectivity with the commodification of life itself. And so what I had in my booth was just this real simple explanation of that there are 5 undescribed species of wild fish, in other words, species not yet studied by scientists and therefore without officially assigned names, that were caught in undisclosed regions of the Amazon basin in just the year prior, and that once they're out of that country of origin, they're legal commodities, and that they are arbitrarily assigned an L number since they are new to science and lack a species name. So I exhibited L14, L25, my favorite, L26, L27, and L427. Each fish tank for each of the 5 fish were built according to the exact dimensions of the fish itself. So they were just multiplied, and so they're the equal proportion of the fish itself. And then here we have coming in from South America to Hanover, Germany, from Hanover, Germany into Basel, Switzerland, are still alive and well, L26, L25. Here's our head of animal husbandry of the region, unpacking them, L25, L26, and there's that beautiful, well, this is actually L26, sorry, I get them confused sometimes. This is 427, 26. And then they were situated on a set of stadium bleachers. The idea being that people can kind of sit up on the bleachers and hang out with them. In a way, though, instead of us becoming the viewers of them, they really become viewers of us as people begin to scratch their heads, like looking at them. They're very sedentary fish. They don't move very much because they eat wood. They don't need to ambush anything. They also are very nearsighted, so they're not spooked by people walking even with a foot away from them because they don't need to see very far because, again, they eat wood. And so they had this very sedentary kind of contemplative quality to them in their presence. People were very confused and, of course, asking, like, wait, is it true what the wall label says? Like, these are unknown to science? Like, yeah, they're new, they're just L numbers, you know, they're, but new to science, yes. And they're alive? Oh, yeah, they're alive. And it's art? Oh, yeah, it's art. It's definitely art. It's a sculpture. In fact, it's an edition of 2. And, and so it's for sale. And so, so that the purpose, though, of the whole project is that they don't exist in our scientific knowledge base, and they exist, though, in an economic niche market. But in a way, they're kind of still undefined. And so really it's just this living being facing you, and you're kind of confronted with your own preconditions of understanding of what this other life is. And so it's that kind of naked moment of releasing your cultural baggage in a way. Or at least that's how I kind of philosophized it in a way. My favorite, though, was when, but the kids loved it. Oh my goodness. And then, of course, PETA was there. And they wrote a press release demanding that we put more water in the fish tank, more vegetation, and put all these demands. And then I very nicely and published it through the newsletter that was sent out daily by the art fair. So I really appreciate your concern, because that's why, that's at the heart of my interest as well, is our concern for our non-human friends in the world. But you have to understand that if I were to put more water in there, it would kill them, because there's a bacteria that they grow with that comes from their place of origin. If I were to put vegetation in the water, that would kill them, again, because that's not natural to their ecosystem and their environment, and they're very prone and sensitive to the bacteria, and that we took great measures to keep that water recycled through their tank for the full months that they were in transit. And so I explained to them what that whole process was, and the fact that when this exhibition is done, they go to a place in Hanover, which is one of the great places called Pantarei, where they work with scientists, as well as they take money from the industry that circulates these fish around the world, but it's a way to also help fund the science and then protect the regions from which these fish come. And so there is, again, it's a little bit of a Robin Hood moment, a little bit, but it's conflicted, you know, as a lot of these things are. My favorite, though, was when this gentleman right here was, he was closing a deal on Andy Warhol, and was like screaming into the phone, like, no, I said not a penny less than 2.3, a million, of course. And the fish, you know, as everybody else is scratching their heads looking at these fish, like, wait, you're new to science, but what are you? Who are you? And then then the fish are totally disinterested, like don't care about our conflict of trying to understand who they are, you know. And then meanwhile, there's this guy screaming about Andy Warhol and over them all. So then instead of a press release, we handed out T-shirts, which showed, this is like team knowledge, so this was all the known species, and this is team commerce, which you can't see it because the lettering is so tiny, and the contrast is kind of blown out from the projector, but it was a whole list of all of the ones that were unknown to science. Of course, all of the collectors loved team commerce, and all the curators loved team knowledge, and so that's how that worked. And this is just simply a turtle holding up a piece of concrete, and that's actually all that is. Okay, so then a project, I'm going to show you one slightly complex project, one really simple project, and then we're going to talk about the project that's in the Blue Lagoon. It takes time, having experienced that place. It takes knowledge, having a scientific knowledge, or what the functions are in an ecosystem, and it takes imagination to be able to put all these things together in retrospect to begin to piece together what this notion of ecosystem is. And so I wanted to make a project that try to make some approximation and articulate an architectural space so where we can maybe experience that. So I used a combine harvester, which the combine harvester for me was the stand-in for an ecosystem. The combine harvester does 9 different functions simultaneously. No one human being could watch all 9 functions at the same time. So you'd have to move around it and watch each function separately. A little bit like we don't have the perceptual capacity to watch ecosystem at one time. And so it's something that takes time. And so using the notions of all the components of a combine harvester that may make up this notion of an ecosystem. So I bought a combine harvester. The idea was to extract it into its thousands of pieces and then begin to display it in the museum architecture here. This is a floor plan of it in sort of a strewn out kind of asteroid field, or like I kind of think of it more as like a beast with its entrails pulled out, but the curator preferred to think of it as an asteroid field. And then it was taking this notion of categorization and taxonomy to a level that was so high that the glass was almost going to shatter. So all the pieces were arranged in a front to back orientation, with some pieces left in a wear and tear state, some pieces sandblasted with all their wear and tear and history removed, erased from it. Some pieces were brass plated and brought to a high polish, and some pieces were gold powder coated, a lot like the way like race cars and cars are done. They then were organized according to 9 different ecosystem services based on just my own subjective sensibility as to like what something looks like. Okay, you look like you're definitely water purification. Like you definitely look like you're disease regulation. And so, and I was also really trying to find those inner Brancusi moments within the sculpture. And so here's our combine harvester, beginning to extract it, draining the oil, dismembering it, taking it apart, welding, cutting, blow torching, disassembling, beginning to arrange things out, lay them out in almost a taxonomical way, and then There's my old studio assistant who passed away a couple of years ago in the top right corner. That's Augustine. And doing some test samples for materials, the powder coating for the gold. And then as you approach the museum, after we've installed it here, you begin to see these pieces from the front of the machine as you approach the museum, what's called the corn head here in the front, on a very much blocking the entrance to the museum. And then as you enter, it has, at first, it appears as though it's an exploded drawing in a way. But that kind of predetermined idea of how something would be displayed also begins to erode as you begin to look through all the other elements of it and how it's arranged. Because then there's our operator's chair, which I'll come back to that in a minute. Just want to give you a sense of how it was all laid out. This is moving into another gallery where it's air purification. You can see the wear and tear pieces that contain its history, 40 years of history on it. And then as we move forward, you begin to have these other pieces that are gray. That's the bare metal that got sandblasted off. Above each area or grouping of ecosystem service areas was a metal placard describing the ecosystem service that it was a part of: decomposition of wastes, air purification, erosion and flood control. This piece here was a sampling every single piece of the fasteners that existed within the machine, and the label next to it very simply just said decaying leaves. And so it was a way of making a poetic interpretation of each form based on the grouping of ecosystem service that was contained within. So we had something like this, which also would have been things like sponges for water purification or airborne particle interception, radioactive elements, soil stability, carbon sequestration, apex predator, which was the operator's chair from the tractor, harvest energy of the sun. I love parasitoids, just love them. Specialist predators, but one of my favorites, of course, intellectual development. This was the room then where we had all the pieces kind of brass plated to a really high polish. This is very much modeled after the Egyptian rooms at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, very much taking from just a whole history of museological display methods. I don't have to reinvent the wheel. We already have all of these devices available to us. These images are a little bit blown out. I think the projector is a little bright. But here are all the intrals, the hydraulic and fuel lines and all the electrical cables laid out. So that's all the pollinators area. And as it moves on out the back of the museum, the hopper and the bins and the chutes begin to have their own kind of quality as individual works of their own right. Once everybody gets to this very last moment, they're exhausted. They feel completely lost that I missed the point. But in fact, it's that moment of relief where it's like you finally realize that A plus B definitely does not equal C, and that then you can kind of go back to the museum now, and that's when people typically would enjoy the project more. Once they're not trying to make A plus B equal C, and see that there is, that the work is really relying on their interpretive agency, their ability to interpret and to project ideas onto it. And then the deinstallation was really horrid. We chose the coldest and snowiest blizzardous day of all. This project, though, now it traveled around. It went to Nebraska to the Bemis Center out there, and which was interesting to have a whole different crowd rather than the Northeast kind of art crowd. It then was like Nebraska farmers who it kind of blew their mind that they each have like 9 combine harvesters in their backyard decaying into the fields, and the fact that that could become an artwork and seen as an artwork was really fascinating. So we did a lot of interviews and talks with all these different people that work in agriculture, and these are things that they think about all the time, though, like pollination, erosion and flood control. I mean, they're all, that's part of the mechanics of, and just part of the makings of being a person that works in agriculture. Now the piece it was acquired by this museum in Tasmania, which is an island off of Australia. For those of you who don't know Tasmania, which took it almost a year to get it there because the strict policies on acquiring agricultural equipment into such a small island that also has a long history of invasive species. So to get that project into Tasmania was its own work of art in a way. Okay, the last part I'm going to show you because it's really brief and simple, but I think it's important because climate change is something that Miami-Dade County hears about ad nauseum, I know. And it is understood across all of the United States as ground zero for climate change because of the proximity to the ocean, but also because of what you have in this landscape. You have a growing metropolis that already many decades ago was pressuring the hydrology of the area, and so water has always been a big issue, even just getting enough fresh water for the Miami-Dade metropolitan region. But also you have the Gulf of Mexico over here, where you also have where it comes, the Atlantic seaboard comes down and joins the Caribbean. So you have this immense marine diversity within this environment. And there's a lot of aspects that make it a very dynamic place. So a lot of climatologists and anthropologists always say, like, if you can resolve this issue around water and climate change and kind of bringing our built environment into a sustainable relationship, maybe not a balance, but some kind of sustainable idea with its surroundings in South Florida, then you can do it anywhere on planet Earth because the stakes are so high on all sides. And so, but one way of seeing, so this idea of seeing these things like an ecosystem, what are non-humans, but also here seeing climate change and trying to understand that is something I spend a lot of time also thinking about. So this project that I had done for Storm King Art Center, anybody ever been to Storm King or heard of it? Who's heard of Storm King? Okay, wow, a lot, cool, okay. So Storm King is a sculpture park about an hour north of New York City. They're famous for like these big metal things that sit out there of a lot of no longer living white men. And so there's a lot of that. And that was part of its early modernist legacy, which they are kind of the Museum of Modern Art of that tradition. And they exist within the Hudson River Valley, where in the very epicenter of the Hudson River Valley School of Painting. And so, in fact, Angel Homer even painted on the Storm King grounds itself. Storm King itself, though, when it was taken over in 1960, they took 4.5 years of reshaping the entire landscape to make it look more Hudson Valley-ish, which is really funny because it is the landscape that the Hudson Valley River painters were painting from. So, I had done a project back in 2013 where I buried a tractor in the landscape. Just emphasizing that notion of the conflict between this idea of the machine and the garden, this idea of both a place that looks like a Garden of Eden, but is also a place that's actually been changed, altered, or is even an instrument to instigate industrialism and so forth. So the landscape, what made the landscape this machine, and did the machine come first or the landscape come first, was kind of the notion around that. But just this past year, I did a project with them where I wanted to really do something at a much tinier little level. I didn't want to compete with all the large metal things that all the men had done over the last 4 decades or 5 decades. So I had thought about the unmanicured perimeter area of the Storm King landscape. And so what I did is I just very simply started down the lower right-hand corner at the property line, and I just took a walk. And then as I found things that were of interest, I took note of them, and I made a cast of them. And then when I made that cast, I then transformed that to a wax positive, and then through the lost wax process, did a bronze, brought the bronze back to the piece, never touching the elements on the site or not changing them, and then planting the bronze piece next to that little compositional element that I found interesting, and with 3 feet of concrete and anchoring rods below it, so it's there permanently affixed in the landscape forever. So we actually have a legal agreement with Storm King that if Storm King, let's say 100 years from now, decides they want to sell to Trump Towers and become a hotel or something, or a golf course, the pieces must remain legally. And so they're very simple. You can see my feet there for scale. That's just a little set of branches. Nothing really special to maybe anybody else's eyes. I just liked the little composition. It was really that simple, of just a little reflection and noticing that. Here's what the wax positives look like, and I'm not really sure what the magic trick I'm doing above them is. In the process of doing the lost wax process. And this is and positioning. There was an old deer skeleton, so we even found a deer skeleton to take parts of, and I'm putting the bronze and the concrete next to it. Here's like a stick that had some mushrooms on it, and this is what it looks like afterwards. So you can't really see of course, that we had excavated next to it. That was the hardest part, was actually excavating next to the thing that I had made casts of in order to not disturb it, and then put at least 3 feet of concrete underneath of each one, and then put it all back, and so, without disturbing it. Some of these are deteriorating faster than others. Here's a big slab of bark. Can you tell which one's a bronze? Okay. This is a rock that looks like a hoof, like a deer hoof. This one, a little hard to see in the image, but this is a deteriorating stump that has this kind of gridded, decaying structure to it. This is a root that grabbed a rock, and then the earth is right around it. A vine, grapevine. And so that's the last image I'm going to show of that. And then I want to go over here now and say a little bit about the project that's in the Blue Lagoon. I mean, a couple things to say, though, about the Storm King piece, too, if my computer will work with me. Part of it was that since this idea of foreverness is embedded in the work, and that when a viewer comes to that piece, they are reading, sorry, pardon me, everybody. This is, they're reading that it is forever. That's a notion that we often don't think necessarily outside of our own lifespans. And so this project was something that since it is kind of legally there forever, the notion of foreverness is something that's really complicated. And one can be in the kind of tranquil environments of a forest and kind of have to, again, reconciling that notion of foreverness with the very tranquil quietude of the forest they're sitting within. So it's a personal moment, too. And they exist almost as like time capsules of that moment. In fact, those species may not even exist later in 100, 200 years from now that they were cast from. Yeah?
How do you know that they're there? Like, is any, like,
oh, that map that was at the beginning of the project, they have GPS coordinates of each one on the map. And there's a map in a museum building. And so you have to do this really annoying thing of like photograph the map with the GPS coordinates, and then you can go out in the field and try and find the actual objects themselves. I mean, it's kind of like going on your own little scientific expedition, you know? Again, kids love it. I realize I make art for like kids. I really do. It's like kids love it. And they're the ones that always find the most of them. It's like Easter egg hunt. And my friends, when they go out, like, I don't know, I found 4. And the kid's like, I found 18. You know, and so it's really funny how that works. The piece for, eventually they're going to have a link online. People can actually just pull it up on their phone and then have a choice of whether or not they want to do more of a blind search or if they want to be guided, you know. Studs and Bycatch is the name of the project for the Commuter Biennial here. Woo! Going back to our map of South Florida, again, like the incredible, unique situation that South Florida sits in. It's kind of like the cradle, as if northeastern Africa is the cradle of civilization, well then this is like the cradle of evolution in my mind, with the Gulf of Mexico, eastern seaboard, Caribbean, and the watershed of the Everglades, all converging in this one really condensed moment where with this massively growing metropolis. It's like an amazing situation. And so, thinking about that kind of imbroglio or knotwork of things going on, we have here our airport over here, our 836, 826, and the Blue Lagoon rivers in the middle there. And so it is a site that already sits within this kind of network of the flows of the organic body of the city itself. I mean, so if you think of the city as a vasculatory system, it also is sitting within the middle of that. But it also exists also surrounded by this incredible dynamic aspects of evolution and of the natural world. But in order to sustain this built environment, there's these things called ghost fish, which is when, of course, we're trolling and gill netting, and bycatch, which is the things that are caught on, which are not the intended target of the fishermen. And so I was looking at that notion of just how the kind of the struggle that ensues from that, and that there is no clear one way out of that. There's a number of ways to think about it differently, and a lot of things that we can all do in our society to change that. But again, there's a lot of irrationality embedded within it. And so part of my job as an artist is, in a way, I think of as to document or articulate the irrationalities that embed it within it. Not necessarily to always, I don't have the great solutions. I think that first and foremost is to find ways to see it. And so, and to be closer to it in a way. And so I was thinking about this situation, and again, a little bit like the desert rooftops piece I showed earlier, which is why I wanted to show it, this idea of a formal relationship where we have this stress or a kind of struggle that is ensuing, and using the built environment around us here in Miami, and this is a really common scene, and no matter which part of Miami you're in, of seeing this ongoing building and construction, almost always from ground up, new construction, which is very unique in South Florida, as opposed to where I live between New Orleans and New York City, where it's usually only renovation. There's very little new construction I ever see, except my neighborhood in Brooklyn has just had 3 new skyscrapers put in. So aside from that small little thing. But this idea of the structure itself of the built environment and the structure itself visually and aesthetically is like what we look at with the grid and network of the net itself. And so there begins to be this kind of relationship between the nets, the structure, and the struggle and the sense of growth between them. And even thinking about that notion of a struggle and a kind of agony, you know, I was thinking like, what is that sense, that kind of gnarl, that feeling, that notion that I've seen it before sculpturally, you know, and it's been with us for a couple thousand years. And this is a Greek sculpture, the Laocoon and his sons, which Laocoon was warning the Trojans not to accept the horse because he had a thought that it was a trick. And in order to quiet him, I think it was Apollo who had brought serpents from the celestial sphere to enwrap him and quiet him, and then eventually he would succumb to them. So that sense of agony within it all, and that kind of that struggle was a notion that was very much compositionally part of the development of the project. And so one can begin to see a kind of agony or a confrontation, a struggle ensue. So here back on our Blue Lagoon, perfect place to put a new artwork. First we had to go out and get our pontoon. There's Courtney and Laura getting the pontoon, taking a picture to email me and say, look, it looks good, right? And next thing, of course, we had to start building our housing structure. But we did not have to build this to New York City building code, nor Miami-Dade building code, which is thankfully a relief. And then, of course, we get it on the pontoon and make it seem just off enough that it might all collapse and fall apart. I need to get myself some fish. I need to learn how to paint fish. We're then going to learn how to impale a fish so it can be put into our structures.
They look like marlins.
Yeah, so we have marlins, sailfish, tiger shark, and 3 tarpon. And here we are in the boatyard where I was working at Middle Point Marina. They graciously gave us the space to work in, which was really a hilarious and amazing experience in its own right. We had to then tow it to the boat ramp, which was almost like its own little mini Mardi Gras parade. And then we had to tow it from the boat ramp out to the site there. So, which, that's another hour-long conversation. There's a couple of people in the audience that are in the know on that one. Let's just say the world almost came to an end. Tow it out to our site and then position it. And the positioning is really key because it's really meant to be ideally seen by people traveling eastbound on the 836. And so it's really hard to see by land. If you have a telephoto lens, you can get a good zoom in from land if you trespass on the office building property over there. But really it's meant to be seen from the 836. And as you can see, there's a lot of airplanes laying all around it. This notion of infrastructure here, I like this image because it shows the piece itself just melds into pure infrastructure. We have a highway with semis and the airport behind it. And so that kind of melding into that environment while also standing out at the same time. It's a piece that with and the requisite wave runners, of course. So it's a work that is both, could be seen from one perspective as really kind of sad and not horrifying, but definitely there's a pain behind it. There's a sadness behind it. They have that feeling as though they are themselves ghost fish, the fish that are trapped in gill nets and then die. But also at the same time, there's a humor to it, of course. I think it was like it's a pin cushion. It's also, and from a different way of seeing it, it could be seen as a thriving school of fish, writhing through the structure. It's not entirely clear. It's a bit ambiguous. Is it actually falling off and slipping and sinking, or is it actually uplifting? And in fact, also as airplanes keep taking off, there's a few photographs or videos I had taken where the piece, it's taking off in the same direction in which the piece is uplifted. So there's a couple different ways in which to see it. I think it's more like this irrationality that can be embedded within an artwork that can also articulate simultaneously the kind of world we live in, where we have these conflicting notions that exist at the same time and make up the reality of our world. What was really funny is that this morning, somebody had tagged it already. And there was a sheet put up that's spray painted that said, what was his name? Alan, what's the guy's name? Alex Hanna, who there's billboards where you can. Yeah, it's about. Yeah, so he gets you off parking tickets and stuff, you know. But then somebody also put a sign that said for rent on it. So then as I motored out there this morning to go take it down, like, ha guys, okay, real funny. And then the alarming thing is that the phone number is 917-208-0066, which is my phone number. And so so I don't know if it was a friend, somebody in this room, maybe? Or if it's maybe even a former student. I have a suspicion of a former student. So anyhow, but fear not. It's been sterilized. It's been sterilized now. Anyway, so that's the end of my talk about. We should have some questions about the Commuter Biennial. Thank you. Maybe a question for Courtney and Laura here. But how do you see them putting you on the spot? So you've now been working through this whole process for a year, and so it's been more than a year?
Like 2 years.
Oh, 2 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And so this project kind of was realized quite late, what the idea was going to even be.
Right.
Let alone it was just finished like 2 days ago or something. So how do you see this whole process, and then how do you see this work kind of working within the overall curatorial project of the Commuter Biennial?
I feel like every work is very in line with the project, and you don't know, obviously, you have a feeling of how it's going to evolve, and then it ends very differently. But a lot of my relationship to contemporary art has been in the sphere of museums with people who aren't always museum goers. And I wanted to talk to not museum goers. So you met my brother Robert, who's a fisherman, and so I would like bounce all my ideas off of him. And
okay,
so
that's a
I
good
was
idea.
like, what is public art to me? So it's always like Christo and Jean-Claude and the Wrapped Islands, right? So not great for the environment. And then I would go and talk to my parents, and they live in the sailfish capital of the world, so it's very fitting. And everywhere you go, there's a roundabout with public art of sailfish. Like, and so like that's very cheery and like very appropriate. That's public art for them. And I was just like, but it's not an accurate representation of like contemporary art and where we live in the moment that we live in.
Yeah.
And so I don't remember how we got to like Blue Lagoon. And I guess it was just the idea that people think of contemporary art in Miami and South Beach and this beautiful Biscayne Bay and the Wrapped Islands, and I was just like, well, given suburban growth, you have the exact opposite. So every time you're stuck on the 836, it seems to be growing, right? That man-made lake gets bigger and bigger. And so let's activate these real places that talk about climate change, right? And so, I mean, you have really hit the nail on the head. And it's okay that, obviously, I talked to some people who were driven by it, but they didn't know it was your work, and they didn't know it had to do with us or the show to get their response.
They're like, next time you do that show, you should really include this piece.
and there's like a lot of what the hell is that? But it's been overall so positive and so fun because every work actually ends up relating to the suburban growth, whether it's like Juan doing these public parking spots in Homestead, or you or Virginia Overton down in Palmetto Bay. So like it's been a really nice evolution where I didn't think, like Courtney had a lot of faith that this would all come together curatorially, that it all fits under this umbrella.
Yeah.
It's been a wild ride. gosh.
Yeah, it has been a wild ride, and I think one of the things that I continue to echo throughout the process to Laura was that it doesn't always like it's okay if it's not literal, and it's okay if people don't get it. You know that we have this sensibility about how we're activating commuters and commuter spaces and creating interventions and really underutilized spaces that are sort of ripe for activation. Right there,
Yeah.
are all of these. The Blue Lagoon being perhaps the crowning jewel and the prime example of this. And that all of the works that we've included in this, whether or not they relate directly to somebody's physical time commuting, which, you talk a lot about your work being inspired by, these thriving metropolises, and in Miami it's really beyond that, it's a megalopolis, that there's so much traveling from the suburban fringes to the urban core in particular, that becomes its own sort of microcosm of art tourism where people are coming from the fringes to go to art museums or to come to galleries. And that's something that just that process in and of itself, the schlep, can be discouraging, especially for somebody that may or may not consider themselves to be an avid art enthusiast. And if there's anything that might seem a little daunting or intimidating about that, if on top of it you have to take a bus and 2 trains or drive for 45 minutes or more to get there, that's not necessarily the best way for us to be engaging the public with contemporary art. And public art can be so many things, and I think that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to work on this with Laura, is about sort of expanding access, and in this sort of fun, cheeky, subversive, and what the hell is that kind of way, we are, even subtly and in this kind of passive way, creating access points for people to engage with public art. And this piece, I think, is one of the most critical ones, and I'm so glad it's kind of the note that we're rounding out this exhibition on, because it does speak so directly to the climate impact component that I think is inevitably a component of the commuter lifestyle that we all engage in, which we can't really avoid, the carbon footprint that leaves, the fact that we are sort of on the precipice of sinking, the seas are rising around us. And there are a lot of ways to look at this, and we have gotten a lot of really mixed reactions, including even on Instagram the other day, there's an Instagram account called Only-in-Dade where people will share their stories of things that they see, where what absurd thing has happened on the road today, or my life in Miami. And that's the life that we live in. We love that about Miami, that there are all of these uniquely absurd interactions, and somebody driving by took a video of this going by, and it's like, pardon my French, I'll censor it for the kids, the stuff you see in Miami, and there's like a face palm emoji, and I love that, and I figured out who posted it, and I messaged her back, and I was like, that's one of our please come read more about this, and I love that, even if not all of the reactions that you get to this are, immediate, a sense of being enthralled or captivated, or immediately getting this sense of, oh, this is a commentary on how we're interacting with the built environment and what are the consequences for the ecosystem we live in. It's creating that disruption of whether it's a daily drive or it happens to be a time that you're going to the airport. It's unavoidable. It smacks you in the face. And it's conceptual. It's not necessarily, it's easy to grasp, but there are so many layers and nuances to it. And I think that's something that is important to incorporate into public art practices. We see a lot of public artworks in Miami that are beautiful, but they're a little easy. They're just sort of pretty things plopped in a high traffic pedestrian area. And that's great. This isn't an either or, this is a yes and. And I think, I look at this, and one of the ways that I see it is, it's kind of a little post-apocalyptic. What happens when we are underwater, and if all of this sea life adapts and survives, there will be fish swimming in our houses. And that there are all of these different ways to consider this, as well as, understanding the sort of beauty of the formal structures, the engineering of cantilevering this thing on this boat. Even watching that process was just the greatest thing to me, and hilarious. If you didn't have a picture of this, we had a kitten helper at the boatyard. That was maybe my favorite thing. He just kept showing up and
So is it a kitten that's helping you, or is it?
No, it just showed up where they were doing the work on this. But
Its name was Busy.
Its name was Busy. It was keeping busy. But even those small moments, even though it was a cat, not necessarily, a domesticated animal, that even in the construction process, you can't separate yourself from the things happening around you. And I think I think this work
Yeah, I think the cheeky was really a goal in a way also. You can't underestimate cheeky, the value of cheeky. I mean, on the one hand, it's, you have basically like 3.5 seconds for somebody to get something into their retinal memory, you know, and so some of the original proposals I had done like really wouldn't work. One was like, I'm going to introduce a species that used to be here back into the waters that will kind of devour the invasive cichlids and peacock bass that are in here. Okay, that nobody driving by at 65 miles an hour is going to see that. Then another idea was to build a bat house, a floating bat house that would lure the bonneted and South Florida eared bat. Yeah, to lure, which are two of the most invasive, endangered mammals in the Western Hemisphere, to lure them there because there's a roost that was found just a couple miles away in the last year and a half here. And so I was like, oh, if I can get them there. And then the Federal Department of Fish and Wildlife would require that the habitat stay. And so that was my sneaky way of thinking like, oh, I'll build actual habitat for these animals. So, but nobody driving by at 65 miles an hour on eastbound 836 would understand that. So there was a lot of things we went through where you're torn because the site is one thing, and there's a lot of interesting aspects to the site, and it has a lot of good conflicted elements of something really sad and almost like in mourning about it and what it's become. And on the other hand, there's a lot of potential to rethink what we're looking at. But in the end, I had to be able to do it in 3.5 seconds. And so it was a very interesting kind of problem, because I think we went through, I don't know, 8, 9 proposals. 10 proposals? Maybe 12? It's 8, okay.
Don't forget the Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Oh, right. I was going to rebuild the Notre Dame spire on it also. But as like a phoenix rising, you know, that was going to... So there was even that going on.
Think about your audience.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, I think that there's a lot. Miami has one of the oldest permanent public art programs in the country, the Miami-Dade Art and Public Places, which is fascinating. But it's got all these elements I think of it as like a frontier land of public art here, because you could, I mean, even somebody tagging it with this other stuff on it. I think I know who did it, who's an artist that's kind of known for doing these things. So that's also really fascinating in that way. To think of it create another platform for another artwork potentially. Anyway, my point is being there's a lot that can be done here. We don't need to just create plop art. It's a big metal thing in front of an office building. We have a whole life around us that can surround an artwork and work in different ways. So.
And I think that's one of the important themes throughout the Commuter Biennial, which is the majority, almost everything that has been put together is site-specific. It's context-dependent. It's driven by context. And that it's, yes, this could exist in a lot of places in Beacon, but it was designed to be in this specific space. And I think that it makes it so much richer. And it's why we love it.
Oh, and it was done with permission.
Yeah. We have permission from the property owners, so
yeah, every body of water in Miami is governed by different agencies, and there are dozens. And it turns out this one is privately owned.
Most
so you can do whatever.
Most of it's privately owned. There's a small section that's public, but yeah, we've learned a lot in this process about.
Feel free to swim out to it as well.
Or kayak, you know what it's like.
I did unfortunately see somebody stop on the side of 836 this morning to get out and take a selfie with it.
Maybe don't do that.
So I might have to move it a little further away from the high. I'm not sure. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Any questions though that on even the other projects that I showed or anything at all? I don't know.
I have a silly and challenging question.
Please.
I apologize, I forget the name of the rooftop piece.
That's a rooftop.
What was the best and most stupid question you received on it?
That is an excellent question. Yeah. Okay. So, because that was also part of the Fox News thing where they were building a controversy and they do the men on the street interviews everybody and like, well, I don't know. I thought it was like a Santa's village because, you know, it's November and Christmas is coming. And then another person's like, well, I think it's going to be like an underground nightclub. And then the lady, the Fox reporter was like, well, what do you think of, like to this other person, what do you think of, I mean, it being an artwork? And the other person's like, so all the artworks are inside, underneath it, underground? And then so it's like somebody also thought that, that a developer was building the top of a skyscraper first. They were going to build it up underneath of it or something. It was hilarious. And then my favorite, though, which which I'm not sure if it's the dumbest or the smartest, actually, was that the lady's like, well, the reporter, this other person's like, well, it's an artwork, though, sir, and it's called Desert Rooftops. And he's like, Desert Rooftops? Like, but I see people in there. It's not deserted at all. So yeah, it had a whole. Oh God, yeah. So and then while we were making it, the lead project manager for the construction company I was working with is a playwright, and so he was keeping notes the whole time, and I have a whole set of notes just in my files from that. But yeah, so the public engagement with the work, like again, that's that life around a work, which so whenever like there's a short documentary on that project, and we talk about all of that. And it's important that that's really part of the work. It's not just this thing you stare at, but it is a part of it. It's an interruption in the middle of the built environment, but also it's an active one. And even getting the union crews in there was like the rat and everything was hilarious. Then we all became best friends by the end of the day. But so yeah, the dynamic, active part of a public artwork, not a static thing you look at, but a thing that interrupts the flow of something to kind of see that space a little differently, even just for a moment, you know.
For someone who works often in public art, I find that a lot of your work is inconspicuous. Like, this is probably one of your most conspicuous pieces. Like, did you have an urge or something? You were like, well, maybe it's better upside down and the whole sculpture's underwater.
It really all came down to that 3.5 second thing. 3.5 seconds. And it's like, okay, so what can happen in 3.5 seconds? Yeah. Which is interestingly antithetical to the way I usually work. I mean, I only explained 2 out of like 24 projects that have this long like research background component to it. Well, I could really put you all to sleep. I mean, I can go, wait till I get into geology. I mean, there's this whole one I did last year on Governor's Island, New York, that's all about geology and deep time. Well, I mean, the kids would be the ones awake, like, oh, that's amazing, dinosaurs. And I'll even be asleep. But but that 3.5 second thing was interesting. Like it's like that turtle stop piece. It's a turtle hold a piece of concrete up. Like there's no explanation needed for it. There's no backstory. There's no research. It's just a thing, and it kind of tells its story immediately. So that was the hope, is that within 3.5 seconds. I mean, it's ambiguous. It's not hitting. It's not too much on the nose, but it's like kind of tells it pretty quickly, like a billboard in a way, but a sculptural billboard in a way that floats and spins and has a potential to sink. So. Yeah.
That'll make the de-install much easier.
Okay, any other questions, folks? Well, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful. Thank you. Yay!